All right, folks, ready to dive into some deep metaphysics.
Always ready for a good metaphysical plunge.
Let's do it then. Today we're taking a deep dive into neutral monism, and for this one we'll be unpacking the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry.
Ah, yes. Neutral monism. A real head-scratcher. It really shakes up how we think about reality.
It does, doesn't it? It's a theory that I think any philosopher listening in is really going to want to grapple with.
Definitely. Pushes you to think outside those familiar boxes of mind and matter.
Right, right. So maybe let's start there. For anyone who's, maybe not as deep into philosophy, what exactly is neutral monism?
Okay, so neutral monism basically says this. The most basic reality, like the fundamental stuff of the universe, it's not mental, it's not physical, it's something neutral.
Something neutral.
Yeah, and that neutral essence is what everything's made of, mind and matter.
So it's like there's this underlying stuff, and it could, I don't know, become either mind or matter.
Exactly. It's trying to solve that age-old mind-body problem, right?
Yeah.
By saying, look, they both come from the same source.
I see, I see. But I mean, even if there is this neutral essence, doesn't that just push the problem back a step?
Yeah.
Like, where does this essence even come from? What's it like?
That is the million-dollar question, right? And that's where things get really interesting. The Stanford Encyclopedia, it lays out 5 different ways to interpret what we mean by neutrality, and each one leads down a different rabbit hole.
5. Oh boy. Okay, well, we've got to break those down then.
All right, let's do it. So first up, we have the neither view.
Mm-hmm.
This one says that the most basic building blocks of everything, they're not mental, they're not physical, they're just in between.
Not one, not the other, just kind of existing.
Yeah, exactly. They exist in this kind of neutral zone belonging to neither category.
But then what are they? If they're not mental or physical, what kind of properties do they even have? How can we even, begin to think about something that completely defies our normal categories?
That's the challenge with all the interpretations of neutral monism. How do we wrap our heads around this neutral stuff?
Okay, fair enough. So what's the next interpretation?
Next, we have what's called the actual constituent view. This one suggests that those neutral elements, they're actually like ingredients in both mental and physical things.
Ingredients. So like my thoughts, the chair I'm sitting on, they're all made from the same basic stuff, just arranged differently.
Yeah, like different recipes using the same ingredient.
Oh, okay. That's a lot to take in. And then we have, what was it?
The possible constituent view, it's similar but subtle difference. It says those neutral entities, they have the potential to become part of mental or physical stuff, but they might not actually be a part of both at any given time.
So it's not that they're currently part of both, but they could be either. Okay, I see the nuance there. I can already see how that could lead to very different philosophical arguments. What about the other 2 interpretations? What are those?
All right, so then there's the law view. This one says both mental and physical laws, they both govern these neutral building blocks. So it's like the same fundamental rules apply to both the mind and the physical world.
But doesn't that mean there's some kind of interaction between the mental and the physical then? Isn't that what neutral monism was trying to get away from in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one that those who support this interpretation have to wrestle with. And finally, there's the most mind-bending of them all.
I'm almost afraid to ask.
It's called the both view. This one says the basic entities are somehow intrinsically both mental and physical at the same time.
Both. How is that even, how can something be both mind and matter at the same time?
Yeah.
Doesn't that just completely contradict the very definitions of those terms?
It definitely stretches the limits of our understanding. It's a very paradoxical concept.
It is. So do we need new definitions of mental and physical then? Where do we even go from there?
It's definitely led to a lot of debate, amongst philosophers, a lot of head scratching.
I bet. So we have these 5 interpretations of neutrality, and each one raises so many questions. But to really grasp how this all plays out, I think we need to look at some of the big thinkers, right? The ones who really championed neutral monism.
Right, the pioneers.
Yeah, like Ernst Macher, William James, Bertrand Russell. Each one had their own unique take on how this neutral foundation actually shows up in our experience. So let's start with Mach. What was his angle?
Mach was all about sensations. Like for him, sensations were those neutral elements of reality. Everything we experience, mental, physical, it all boils down to these basic building blocks of sensation.
So for Mach, it's like the world is just this collection of pure experiences. And the difference between mental and physical is just how we're I don't know, sorting them in our minds.
Exactly. He saw the whole mind-body problem as kind of a false
Or
dichotomy.
they made up problem.
Yeah, like the separation is just a matter of perspective, not a fundamental difference in reality itself.
Okay, but then wouldn't that mean that reality is subjective, dependent on, each person's experience? How can we have a shared understanding of the world if it's all just a matter of how I experience it versus how you experience it?
That's a big one. That's one of the main critiques that's been leveled at Mach's view, for sure. And it's a
Yeah.
good question, and it's a tough one to answer, for sure. But moving on from Mach, we have William James. Now, he had a bit of a different
Oh
perspective.
yeah, James. Definitely a big name in philosophy.
Absolutely. And instead of sensations being the neutral element for James, it was this idea of pure
It's
experience.
your experience. What does that even, I mean, can you unpack that a little? It sounds kind of abstract.
It is a bit abstract. So James believed that before we start, categorizing our experiences, like saying this is a thought, this is a feeling, this is a perception, before all that there's this raw stream of consciousness. And that's what he called pure experience. It's like the unfiltered, undifferentiated stuff of awareness. Everything else kind of springs from that.
So it's like there's this primordial soup of consciousness. And from that, we create all the distinctions like mind and world, self, and other, all that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But then the question is, if everything comes from this pure experience, how do we account for the objective world, the world outside of our own minds?
Right, right. Because that's a big one. How do we know there's anything out there independent of us?
Well, James would say that distinction between subjective and objective, it's not inherent in reality. It's a product of our minds, of how we think about things.
So the world as we know it, as we experience it, it's a construction, something that comes from the interaction between this pure experience and our brains, basically.
Exactly. And our brains are constantly evolving, adapting, so that construction's always changing too.
That's a pretty huge idea. It challenges the whole notion of an objective reality, doesn't it?
It does, and that's what makes James so interesting to read. But then we come to Bertrand Russell, and he had yet another take on neutral monism.
Oh yeah, Russell, another giant of philosophy. So what was his spin on it?
For Russell, it was all about sensations and percepts. He saw theirs as the neutral building blocks of reality.
Sensations again. So kind of like Mach, but with a Russellian twist.
Yeah.
How did he differ from Mach?
Well, while Mach saw sensations as the ultimate constituents of reality, Russell thought of them more as the raw data of
Or
experience.
raw data, okay.
But that's not all there is. We also have percepts, and those are our interpretations, our organizations of those sensations.
So it's not just about what our senses pick up, but about how our minds then process that information, make sense of it.
Exactly. It's like sensations are the building blocks, but percepts are the blueprints that tell us how to put them together.
I see. But then if those percepts are mental constructions, how do we know they accurately reflect the outside world?
That's a very good question, and it's one that Russell grappled with quite a bit. How can we be sure that what we perceive actually corresponds to what's really out there? He believed that logic and scientific inquiry, those were our best tools for getting closer to the truth, even if we can never fully grasp it directly.
So even though we're working with these neutral building blocks, we can still strive for objectivity. It's just that it's a process, it's a journey.
Right. It's about constantly refining our understanding, getting closer and closer to an accurate picture of reality.
Okay, that makes sense. But it also brings up all these questions about what truth even is,
Yeah.
and how we can ever be sure of anything.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into a common critique of these early neutral monists. The fact that they relied so heavily on experience led some to say that, well, maybe neutral monism is just phenomenalism with a new coat of paint.
Phenomenalism. Remind me what that is again.
Phenomenalism is the idea that reality is ultimately just our sense perceptions. There's nothing beyond that.
Oh, right, right. So the critics are saying that by basing their theories on experience, whether it's Mach's sensations or James's pure experience or Russell's sensations and percepts, they're basically reducing reality to what we perceive.
Right, and that's a problem for many philosophers, because then it seems like reality becomes entirely subjective.
So it becomes this kind of solipsistic view where everything is just a projection of my own mind.
Yeah, that's the worry. But, those who defend neutral monism, they would argue that it doesn't have to lead to that. They'd say, look, experience is the starting point, sure, But that doesn't mean there isn't a world out there independent of our minds. It's just that that world is ultimately made of the same stuff that our experiences are made of.
Okay, so it's not that our minds are creating the world,
Yeah.
but our minds are a part of this bigger neutral reality.
Hmm.
And our experiences give us a window into what that reality is like.
Exactly. It's a more nuanced view than just saying everything is subjective.
Okay, that makes sense. But neutral monism has had its fair share of critics. And we've just scratched the surface. So let's get into some of the arguments, both for and against this theory. It's a fascinating one, but it's also pretty controversial. Where should we start?
Well, one of the things that makes neutral monism appealing, especially to a philosopher like you, is its parsimony. Instead of two completely different things, mind and matter, you have one neutral essence.
Ah, simplicity. Always a good thing in philosophy, right? Keeping simple.
Right. It's like Occam's razor applied to metaphysics. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity.
And of course, we've talked about how it tackles the mind-body problem head-on. But what are some other points in its favor?
Well, another strong point for neutral monism is that it might actually offer a way to solve the problem of perception.
The problem of perception. What do you mean by that?
So the question is, how do our experiences, the things we see, hear, feel, how do those relate to the actual physical world? By saying that both our experiences and the physical world are grounded in the same neutral substance, neutral monism bridges that gap.
So it's not that our senses are giving us a distorted view of reality. It's that those perceptions are a direct manifestation of that underlying reality.
Yeah, just filtered through our particular, cognitive apparatus, our brains.
Okay, I see. So our perceptions, they're subjective in the sense that they're filtered through our individual minds,
Rare.
but they're still grounded in something real, something that exists outside of us.
Right. Neutral monism is saying there is a world out there independent of our minds, but it's made of the same stuff that our minds are made of. But of course, like I said, there are also criticisms.
And I think one of the big ones is this accusation of reductionism. Can we really explain everything about the mind, especially consciousness, with this idea of a neutral essence without, losing something crucial along the way?
It's a huge challenge, and a lot of critics would say, no, we can't. They'd say, look, you're reducing everything to this neutral essence, but what about the richness, the complexity of mental experience, the feeling of pain, the joy of love, the subjective experience of what it's like to be conscious?
Right, like you can show me the basic building blocks, sure, but how do I get from those to the vivid inner world of my own experience? How do you explain that?
Exactly. The critics are worried that neutral monism, in its attempt to unify mind and matter, ends up flattening the mind. It strips away the very qualities that make it so fascinating.
That's a good point. It's like in trying to solve one problem, are we creating another?
And there's another criticism it's kind of related, this suspicion that maybe neutral monism is actually just mentalism in disguise.
Mentalism.
Yeah.
So the idea that the mind is the fundamental reality and the physical world is somehow less real.
Right. Some philosophers argue that by putting so much emphasis on experience, neutral monism might actually be privileging the mental over the physical.
So despite its claim to neutrality, it could be tipping the scales in favor of the mind. That's interesting. But then isn't there also the opposite worry? That it could actually be a subtle form of materialism.
That's right. Some people worry about that too.
Wait, how could it be both? Mentalism and materialism. Those seem completely at odds with each other.
It really depends on how you interpret neutrality. If you say that those neutral elements are fundamentally physical, then you could see neutral monism as just another way of saying that the physical world is all there is. And mental phenomena, they're just, reducible to physical processes.
So it's like, depending on how you define that core concept, neutral monism could swing in either direction, towards a mind-first ontology or a matter-first ontology.
Yeah, it can get pretty slippery. And that highlights how crucial it is to really define our terms carefully. What do we mean by neutral? What are the underlying assumptions we're bringing to the table?
Absolutely. Okay, so beyond those concerns about reductionism, mentalism, materialism, are there any other big criticisms that we should talk about?
Oh, definitely. One of the most persistent challenges is the problem of experience. This one's often raised by philosophers like Galen Strawson.
Galen Strawson, yeah.
So they argue, if the neutral essence is non-experiential, how can it possibly give rise to experience? Like, how do you get something from nothing?
Right, if the fundamental building blocks of reality lack this quality of experience, How can they come together to create something that does have experience? How do you get there?
Exactly. Critics say, look, both neutral monism and materialism, they face a huge explanatory gap when it comes to experience, especially the subjective qualitative nature of experience, the qualia.
Okay, yeah, qualia.
Yeah.
That's a big one. Its likeness of experience, and then there's the problem of emergence, right?
Right. How do you explain how truly new properties emerge in complex systems?
Yeah, because it's not enough to just say, oh, everything's made of the same basic stuff.
Yeah.
We have to explain how you get from that basic stuff to the incredible diversity and complexity we see in the world.
Right. You have to explain the jump from, I don't know, an atom to a brain, for example.
Exactly. And how do you get from a neutral foundation to all of that? Just,
Yeah.
life, consciousness, all of it.
And so the critics, they would say, look, neutral monism has to appeal to some kind of unexplained emergent principle, which is a bit of a cop-out.
A bit of a hand wave. And then just to add another wrinkle, there's also the dualism suspicion, right? Some philosophers see neutral monism and say, well, isn't this just property dualism in disguise?
That's another big one.
So the argument is that if physics, if that's just describing the structure of reality, but it's leaving out the intrinsic qualities, the stuff that we experience directly, then aren't you essentially creating two separate realms, the physical and the experiential?
Yeah, that's the worry. That instead of solving the mind-body problem, you're actually just, reintroducing a form of dualism.
It's like instead of substance dualism, you have property dualism. So neutral monism, it's kind of walking this tightrope, isn't it? Trying to avoid all these philosophical pitfalls. It's got to avoid materialism. It's got to avoid mentalism. It's got to avoid collapsing into property dualism.
It is. It's a delicate balancing act, for sure.
Yeah.
But despite all of those criticisms, neutral monism has been having a bit of a resurgence in recent years,
Yeah.
especially within discussions of Russellian monism and its variations.
Ah, yes, Russellian monism. That's where
Mhm.
things get really interesting. Russellian monism, yeah. So is this like, I don't know, neutral monism 2.0? What's the upgrade?
You could say that, yeah. It takes that core idea that there's this fundamental neutral reality, and it really zooms in on the nature of matter. It says, okay, the way physics describes the world, it's incomplete. It tells us about the structure, the relationships, but it leaves something out, something really important.
Okay. So it's not just that everything's made of the same stuff, but it's like, well, what is that stuff really? What's missing from our current picture?
Exactly. Russellian monism says that matter has intrinsic properties, like properties that go beyond what physics can describe. They're not directly observable, but they're what give rise to consciousness and to the physical properties that we do observe.
So it's like there's this hidden layer of reality, a kind of inner life of matter that we haven't been able to access with our scientific instruments.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And this is where it gets really exciting. Some Russellian monists, like David Chalmers, they say these intrinsic properties, they're proto-experiential.
Proto-experience.
Yeah. So it's not full-blown consciousness like what we have, but it's like a rudimentary version, a basic quality that, under the right conditions, could lead to consciousness.
So even an electron, a quark, something like that, they might have this very basic form of experience. That's a pretty wild idea.
It is pretty wild, but it offers a way to address that hard problem of consciousness. It says maybe the seeds of experience are there right from the start, even at the most fundamental levels of reality.
I see. So you don't need to have this separate mind substance or some mysterious process where consciousness just pops out of nowhere. It's kind of baked in from the beginning.
Right. It's a much more elegant solution, and it keeps things, nice and parsimonious.
Yeah. Okay, I'm following. But are we saying that everything in the universe is in some way conscious then?
Well, that's where the idea of panpsychism comes in.
Panpsychism, right. So that's the view that consciousness, or at least some kind of mind, is a fundamental feature of everything.
Yeah, it's often associated with Russellian monism, though not all Russellian monists go that far.
So panpsychism goes even further than saying there's this proto-experiential quality. It's saying that even the simplest things, like electrons, have some level of actual consciousness.
That's the general idea, though there are many different flavors of panpsychism, of course. Some might say it's just a very basic awareness, while others might say even simple things have more complex mental properties.
Okay, so we've gone from this neutral essence to proto-experiential properties, and now we're talking about the possibility that everything is, in some sense, conscious. It's a lot to wrap my head around.
It is a lot. And then there's another idea that's closely related. It's called panqualityism.
Pan-qualityism. Okay, another pan something. What's this one about?
So instead of experience, this one focuses on qualities. Things like redness, roundness, the taste of chocolate.
Qualities. Okay. But don't all physical objects have qualities? What's special about this?
The key difference is that in panqualityism, those qualities aren't just subjective experiences. Like, it's not just that we see something as red or round, it's that those qualities are actually in the objects themselves. They exist whether or not there's anyone there to perceive them.
So my experience of a red apple, that's not just my mind making things up. It's a direct apprehension of the redness that's actually in the apple itself.
Exactly. Panqualityism says the richness of our experience, it reflects the richness of reality itself. It's a way to connect those two things, the subjective and the objective.
Like it turns materialism on its head, you know?
Yeah.
Because materialism often says those qualities are just in our heads.
Right, right.
But panqualityism is saying, no, they're out there in the world. It's really interesting to think about.
It is. And all of this, it shows how neutral monism, especially Russellian monism, opens up these whole new ways of thinking about the mind, matter, and experience.
It really does. It's like we've been stuck in this rut, thinking about things in a certain way, and then neutral monism comes along and shakes everything up.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's really refreshing.
Yeah.
And speaking of shaking things up, the Stanford Encyclopedia, it mentions some other interesting contemporary developments in neutral monism.
Yeah.
One that caught my eye was Kenneth Sayre's idea that information is the ultimate reality.
Oh, Sarah, yeah. Informational monism. That's a fascinating one.
It is.
Yeah.
So how does that work? How does information fit into this whole neutral monist framework?
So Sayre says that reality, at its most basic level, is made up of information states. And those states, they're not mental, they're not physical in the usual sense, but they're the building blocks for both.
So instead of particles, waves, all that, we should think of the universe as being made up of bits of information.
Yeah, kind of like the universe is one giant computer.
That's a really different way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And does that approach help with the mind-body problem?
Sayre thinks so. He says both mental states, like thoughts, feelings, and physical states, like the position of an electron, they can be understood as different types of information states. The difference is just how those states are organized, how they're processed.
So consciousness, in this view, would be a particular kind of information processing. It kind of resonates with what people are saying in cognitive science and AI these days.
It does, yeah. And it raises these really interesting questions about information itself. Like, what even is information? How does it connect to physical processes? Can we have a theory of reality that's based on information?
Huge questions, and it seems like we're just starting to explore them. The Stanford Encyclopedia also mentions John Heil and his view that, maybe the mind-matter distinction, it's not a real distinction in reality, it's just a conceptual distinction that we make.
That's right. Heil's view fits in really well with the whole neutral monist perspective.
It's like maybe the mind-body problem isn't a problem at all, but just a result of how we think about the world. We're so used to dividing things into mind and matter that we miss the possibility that they might actually be two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, exactly. He's saying we need to get past that dualistic thinking and see reality in a more holistic way.
Okay, so after this deep dive into neutral monism, what are some of the key takeaways?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is that the mind-body problem, it's still very much an open question. There are a lot of different ways to approach it, and neutral monism offers a really exciting set of possibilities, and it also forces us to think about the nature of reality itself.
It's like we've been staring at this puzzle for centuries, trying to force the pieces to fit, and neutral monism says, hey, maybe you're working with the wrong puzzle altogether.
Exactly. It's a completely different way of seeing things.
And for our listener, the philosopher out there, I think the real value here is in the questions that neutral monism raises.
Mm.
With all these different interpretations of neutrality and the developments in Russellian monism, informational monism, what could a truly robust modern version of neutral monism look like? How can we account for consciousness, qualia, the richness of our experience within a framework that says reality is fundamentally neutral?
These are the questions that, philosophers are going to be grappling with for a long time to come. But that's the fun of it, right?
Absolutely. The journey is the destination. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, keep pondering, keep questioning, and keep exploring the mysteries of the universe.